So let's jump right in, shall we, to the first part of our five-part deep dive. I want to talk about, to begin with, the pandemic and previous plans to combat COVID. Again, if you didn't catch the beginning part of the podcast, what we're doing here is starting the first of a five-part series that we'll be doing over the next few weeks, and I want to look at different aspects in a very deep manner, various aspects of the American Rescue Plan. And if you don't know what the heck that is, it's the $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package that has been proposed by our now President Joe Biden. So again, today is part of the discussion. What I want to do is I want to talk about how previous COVID legislation, so legislation that, not bills that were just kind of, discussed, but legislation that was passed related to COVID, how it actually paved the way for this plan that was proposed by President Biden. And I think this is important, and I really want to start here in our kind of deep dive into the American Rescue Plan, because to understand, not just in this instance, but really in every part of life, to understand where you're going, you have to understand where you've been. And again, the same applies as it relates to COVID legislation. So if you are not aware, okay, because quite frankly, it really hasn't been talked about recently, but if you're not aware, the United States is actually officially in an economic recession due to the COVID pandemic. Why? Why in the heck are we in a recession due to the COVID pandemic? Well, there are a myriad of things that have caused this recession, right? We've had, I think it's somewhere around or over 30 million Americans that have tested positive for COVID-19. We've had about 500,000 people die from COVID. I know two of those people, right? We've also had, wrongly or rightly, depending on kind of your view of things, we've had lockdowns across the country. And whether or not you view it as wrong or right, the lockdowns were ultimately done to curb the spread and try to mitigate some of the damage that was done due to the deaths that I mentioned and the diagnoses that I mentioned. So when we actually look at the COVID pandemic and this recession, there were three things that were brought about, three really big problems as a direct result of the recession that was brought about by the COVID pandemic. The first thing was mass eviction. You may know of some efforts that have been made to curb, to really kind of, stop that from happening, but mass eviction has still been a thing. We've had to deal with ridiculously high unemployment. And then last but not least, we've had an unimaginable hunger crisis. You hear that mentioned sometimes as part of this whole deal, but I want you to kind of close your eyes and think about the times that you may have seen on the news, whether it's been your state, your local area, or other areas where you've seen massive lines for food banks, right? So again, the hunger crisis is not really something that's talked about a lot, especially fairly recently, but that is one of like the big three problems that has been brought about by this recession that was caused by the COVID pandemic. Now, I don't want to, let me just be frank, right? All of this was made super worse than like it already is, it already sounds, it already was. It was made so much worse by the Trump administration, right? President Trump failed, absolutely failed, to have a federal strategy to actually combat the pandemic. Like, in what ways did he fail? We had no nationwide mask mandate. Like, when did you hear of that one, right? President Trump, he didn't even have a testing strategy. He didn't issue sufficient health guidelines to combat COVID. And a lot of times, some of the guidelines that we heard, like, totally contradicted what we had heard. Like, a lot of people were just so seriously confused. And in a lot of ways, the people who should have been making those guidelines were not given the proper authority to actually, put those guidelines out. But again, it's another story for another day. In the very, very, very beginning, President Trump, he also didn't provide, remember when we had that like PPE shortage, right? And hospitals were freaking out. And we were like, oh my gosh, are they going to have to like strap themselves into like garbage bags? Like, right? Now, over time, I will say that he did do better on that, but especially in the beginning, we had a massive PPE shortage. And when you consider the numbers, whether you look at the deaths or the diagnosis, you have to question how many fewer people would have actually been either killed or diagnosed with or due to COVID if we had had proper PPE from the very, very beginning. Not just proper, but like sufficient, right? And then like another place that he failed was when you consider this vaccine distribution strategy. We didn't really find out about the failures of that until we got into the Biden administration, because like it became super clear by this new administration that, we have no strategy, right? So some stuff we knew early on, some stuff we didn't know early on. But whether you're talking in the very beginning or at the end or even after the fact of the Trump administration, in so many ways, the Trump administration made what, quite frankly, was a really difficult time for the American people that much worse. It's utterly insane.